There is a particular kind of silence that follows a phone call you weren't expecting, and in the spring of 2018, John Goodman lived inside that silence for the better part of 2 weeks. Not in public. Not in front of cameras. Just quietly, the way a man built like a small mountain falls apart when something he loves is taken from him before he's ready to let it go. He had just returned to a role he'd worn for nearly 30 years. A sitcom revival was breaking ratings records. And then, within a matter of hours, all of it collapsed because of 40 characters typed into a phone. Years later, sitting across from an interviewer who asked him the question directly, Goodman didn't talk about the drinking, or the roles he didn't take, or any of the usual things a man his age is supposed to regret. He talked about a friendship. And what he said about it is the kind of honest that only comes from someone who has stopped trying to make the story sound better than it actually was. To understand why that answer mattered, you have to go back much further than 2018. You have to go back to a small town outside St. Louis, Missouri, where a boy was born without much room to be anything other than tough. John Stephen Goodman arrived on June 20, 1952, in Afton, Missouri, the third child of Leslie and Virginia Goodman. His father worked as a postal carrier, a steady job in a town built on steady jobs, but Leslie Goodman didn't live long enough for his youngest son to really know him. He died of a heart attack when John was only 2 years old, leaving Virginia to raise 3 children on what a waitress and retail clerk could bring home in the 1950s. She took in laundry on top of everything else. There wasn't a version of John Goodman's childhood that didn't involve his mother working constantly, and there wasn't a version of it that included a father teaching him how to throw a punch, fix a car, or stand up straight at a funeral. He grew up without that particular kind of male presence, and it shaped him in ways he would spend decades figuring out how to talk about. He was a big kid early, and in a school full of smaller kids, that made him a target before it ever made him an advantage. The bullying found him the way it finds most overweight, fatherless boys in a town that doesn't have a lot of patience for softness. What saved him, by his own account, was structure. He joined the Boy Scouts and stayed with it through 9th grade, less because he loved camping and more because it gave him somewhere to belong, a hierarchy that made sense, men he could look up to as something like father figures. He also had an older brother, 14 years his senior, who came home from time to time and introduced him to things that would matter more than anyone could have guessed at the time. Comedy records, bebop jazz, a sense of rhythm and timing that doesn't show up on a resume but ends up living inside every performance an actor ever gives. By the time he reached Afton High School, the size that had made him a target on the playground had become an asset on the football field. He played offensive guard and defensive tackle, good enough that Southwest Missouri State University offered him a scholarship to come play in Springfield. In the fall of 1970, Goodman arrived on campus the way a lot of working-class Missouri kids did back then, with a scholarship and a plan and not much else. The plan lasted less than a season. He tore his ACL before he ever got meaningful playing time, and just like that, the path that had organized his entire adolescence was gone. What happened next is the kind of accident that, looking backward, seems like fate, even though it almost certainly didn't feel that way at the time. With nothing else to do and no clear direction, Goodman wandered into the university's theater department. He auditioned for a play more or less on a whim, expecting nothing. He got the part. He has described the experience of standing on a stage that first time as something close to falling in love, and it is worth sitting with how strange that is, coming from a 300-pound former lineman from a blue-collar Missouri suburb. He found 2 people in that drama department who would go on to become 2 of the most recognizable names in American film and television, Kathleen Turner and Tess Harper. He found a group of people who shared the thing he had just discovered in himself. He stopped looking for a backup plan, because for the first time, he didn't need one. He graduated with a degree in theater in 1975 and did what a lot of young actors with more ambition than money have always done. He got on a train to New York City with a small loan from his brother and an apartment in Hell's Kitchen, back when that name still carried some real danger with it. He waited tables. He tended bar. For one single night, he worked as a bouncer at a club, took instruction from a tough German head bouncer on how to handle difficult customers, and never went back for a second shift. What he did keep going back to was the work nobody glamorizes: off-Broadway productions, dinner theater circuits in Ohio, a run of the musical 1776 down in Miami that paid him in experience more than in money. He kept moving because moving was the only thing that felt like progress. The film career started small and stayed small for longer than most people remember. A 1983 part in Eddie Macon's Run came and went without anyone noticing. A small role in Revenge of the Nerds the following year put him on screen but not in anyone's memory. The real turning point came in 1986, with True Stories, the strange and tender film directed by Talking Heads frontman David Byrne. Goodman played Louis Fine, a lonely, sweet man advertising for a wife on local television, and it gave him his first real lead. He has talked about how gentle that project felt, how much he liked what Byrne was trying to say about small-town Texas life, how he even got to sing in it. It was the first time the work felt like something more than a paycheck. A year later came the Coen brothers, and with them, the kind of professional relationship that ends up defining a career. Raising Arizona, in 1987, cast Goodman opposite Nicolas Cage as Gale Snopes, an escaped convict with absolute conviction and very little intelligence to back it up. Goodman has described the audition as one of the best hours of his professional life, not because he was nervous and nailed it, but because he, Joel, and Ethan simply goofed around in the room, with no pressure and no expectation, and that looseness produced something better than any rehearsed performance could have. He has talked since about how the Coens' dialogue only sounds improvised because it's been engineered so precisely that, once you've lived with it long enough, the words start to feel like your own. You don't improve on what they hand you. You just let it do what it was built to do. Then, in March of 1988, while Goodman was performing in a stage production of Antony and Cleopatra in Los Angeles, an ABC casting scout walked in. The network was scrambling to find someone to play the husband of a brash new comedian named Roseanne Barr in a sitcom built around a working-class family. Goodman walked into the audition, the story goes, told Barr to scoot over, she told him to shut up, and he sat down next to her anyway, and everyone in the room understood instantly that something had just clicked into place. He has called it as easy as falling out of bed. He wasn't trying to manage the outcome. He didn't think he was going to get it. That looseness, the same thing that had worked for him with the Coens, worked again here, and it would keep working for him for the rest of his career, almost as a rule. The moments where he stopped trying to control the result were consistently the moments where he was best. What he didn't know, sitting down beside her that day, was that Barr had wanted someone else for the role entirely. Her boyfriend at the time, Tom Arnold, and that the producers had overruled her, insisting on an actor with real professional experience. That quiet friction, the fact that the man who would become her television husband had not been her first choice, sat underneath the entire run of the show, not always loud, not always visible, but present. Goodman's way of dealing with it wasn't to address it directly. It was to simply become exactly what the role and exactly what Barr needed, a genuine collaborator, someone who made her laugh, someone who stood beside her when things got difficult, without ever turning that loyalty into its own headline. Roseanne premiered on October 18, 1988, and it didn't just succeed, it detonated. By the end of its first season, the show was the second most watched program in America, pulling in over 36 million viewers an episode on average. Numbers like that are almost impossible to comprehend now, in an era when audiences are scattered across 100 different streaming platforms, but at the time, tens of millions of households were tuning in every single week to watch something American television had largely avoided up to that point. Working-class family life, depicted without condescension and without false uplift. The Connors argued about money the way families without enough of it actually argue, in an ongoing, unresolved friction rather than a tidy half-hour resolution. Dan Connor felt like a real person, and making that happen on a weekly basis is much harder than it looks. It earned Goodman 7 consecutive Emmy nominations for the role, and the fact that he never won remains one of the more puzzling oversights in the history of the awards. He did win a Golden Globe in 1993, and used part of his acceptance speech to thank his wife and then joked that he'd like to thank his personal trainer too, except he didn't have one. It was the right joke, delivered at exactly the right moment, by exactly the kind of person who knew not to take the moment too seriously. While Roseanne ran, the film career kept moving on a parallel track, often in a completely different register. Barton Fink, with the Coens again in 1991, gave him Charlie Meadows, a jovial hotel neighbor who turns out to be something else entirely by the film's end. Goodman reportedly stayed in character between takes as the role's true nature revealed itself, unsettling some of his castmates in ways that weren't entirely intentional. The film's climactic hallway fire, with Charlie walking through flames carrying a shotgun, remains one of the most extreme images the Coens have ever put on screen, and Goodman commits to it completely, the way he commits to almost everything he's been handed. Running alongside the success was something darker. Goodman has been open, in interview after interview over the years, about showing up to set hungover, about drinking through the workday, about the unsettling fact that his performances didn't seem to suffer for it. Which, he said, is its own kind of trap, because when there are no immediate consequences, it becomes much harder to recognize what's actually happening to you. He got sober in 2007, and he has talked about it plainly, without theatrics, as something that saved his life. Not a dramatic rock-bottom story told for effect. Just a fact he states when asked, the same way he'd state his height. Behind the scenes of Roseanne, the atmosphere wasn't always smooth. Tensions ran through the show's early years, including a serious clash between Barr and the show's original creator that nearly fractured the production. Goodman, along with castmates including Laurie Metcalf and a young George Clooney, backed Barr in that dispute, and the creator eventually departed. Taking a side in a conflict that public and that serious isn't something you do without understanding what it signals, and Goodman understood exactly what it signaled. His loyalty to Barr wasn't performative. It was built over years of making each other laugh on a soundstage, the specific, slightly dangerous kind of laughing he's described, with real affection, as the kind that always ran the risk of her laughing so hard she'd lose control entirely. By the time the original run ended, Goodman was reportedly earning around $300,000 an episode, making him one of the highest-paid actors on American television. The show closed out in 1997 after 222 episodes, having permanently expanded what a working-class American family could look like in primetime. Goodman has said the ending felt abrupt, not because the show wasn't ready to be done, but because 9 years of showing up to the same set every week builds a kind of gravity that's almost impossible to prepare yourself to lose. He went back to doing what he had always done in the gaps between seasons, chasing the best available work and giving it everything, except now there was no Roseanne to return to when the film wrapped. That was a different kind of life, and he had to build it without a map. The years between the original series and its eventual revival were anything but quiet. He appeared in Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? With the Coens in 2000, playing a one-eyed Bible salesman with a violent streak, a role he's talked about with real relish, particularly the part where his character gets struck with a tree branch in a memorably brutal scene. He appeared in Monsters Ball and Storytelling in 2001, in Intolerable Cruelty with the Coens again in 2003. The work stayed steady, serious, and varied. But the gravitational center that had organized his professional life for 9 years, the table read on Monday morning, the same cast, the same studio audience, was simply gone, and the freedom that replaced it was real but, by his own admission, not entirely comfortable. It was also during this stretch that some of his most enduring film work happened. The Big Lebowski, in 1998, gave him Walter Sobchak, the Vietnam veteran and bowling partner whose character was loosely modeled on real screenwriter John Milius. Goodman studied Milius's mannerisms and built the character outward from there. The infamous car-smashing scene reportedly required something like 17 takes, with a new car destroyed each time, and the production absorbed the cost without complaint because what Goodman was doing with the role was worth it. Walter Sobchak has been quoted and imitated for decades since, in a way that suggests the character tapped into something genuinely recognizable. The specific comedy of a man with zero self-doubt being absolutely certain about everything, all the time. Around the same period, Goodman moved into voice work in a serious way, eventually finding one of his most beloved roles in Pixar's Monsters, Incorporated in 2001. He has talked about spending well over 100 hours in the recording booth, sometimes trying 50 different readings of a single line to find the right tone, building the character of Sully from the voice outward rather than the other way around. When Billy Crystal joined him in the booth for shared scenes, Goodman has said the energy between them simply took off. He'd try to follow whatever Crystal was doing and build something new out of it together. That kind of collaborative aliveness, two performers finding something in the room that neither one could have found alone, is the part of that production he talks about with the most visible joy. In 2011, for the silent film The Artist, he lost roughly 60 pounds to play a studio executive in a role that required him to communicate entirely through physical expression, with no dialogue to lean on. He studied silent-era physical comedy to prepare for a part that, on paper, didn't take up much screen time at all, which has always been his method, regardless of role size. The preparation was never proportional to the minutes on screen. For Argo, in 2012, he played the real-life makeup artist and CIA operative John Chambers, and discovered during research that Chambers had actually designed a prosthetic nose for him years earlier, on an entirely different film, connecting Goodman, through a strange and very specific piece of movie-making trivia, to the actual man he was now being asked to portray. 410, Cloverfield Lane in 2016, he reportedly isolated himself for weeks before filming to get into the headspace of a doomsday prepper, and delivered a performance so quietly menacing that his co-star Mary Elizabeth Winstead has said she was genuinely unsettled during their scenes together, not in a performance sense, but actually rattled. And then, in 2018, the phone rang again about Roseanne. The revival was an enormous success almost immediately, drawing over 18 million viewers on premiere night, a number that climbed past 27 million once delayed viewing was counted, the highest-rated scripted broadcast premiere in years. Goodman has described stepping back into Dan Connor as something like putting on an old pair of shoes. The fit was immediate, the character was still exactly where he'd left him 2 decades earlier. He and Barr fell back into the same rhythm they'd always had together. He said he stood next to her on that soundstage and felt the same thing he'd felt walking into that audition room back in 1988. Something rare, specific, and very hard to find twice in one lifetime, let alone with the same person 3 decades apart. Then, on May 29, 2018, Barr posted a tweet comparing former Obama administration advisor Valerie Jarrett to an ape. The backlash was immediate and total. Within hours, ABC's entertainment president, Channing Dungey, canceled the show outright, calling Barr's comments abhorrent and inconsistent with the network's values. The financial fallout was steep, with advertising losses estimated in the tens of millions. Barr attempted to walk the comment back, attributing it in part to a sleep medication she'd been taking, though the drug's manufacturer publicly noted that racism is not a documented side effect of the medication. Goodman, by his own account, fell apart. Speaking later with Jimmy Kimmel, he described what happened next with a kind of dark, hard-won humor. His wife became ill almost immediately afterward, and at some point during that stretch he fell down a flight of stairs. He told Kimmel he had thought to himself, essentially, that he'd be a big boy about it and handle it like an adult, and instead he just crashed for a couple of weeks. It's the kind of detail that sounds almost absurd stacked together like that. The show gone, his wife sick, himself tumbling down the stairs, but it's also exactly the kind of accumulation that breaks a person who has spent 30 years being the steady one in the room.